It's a real pleasure to be back here again. So hello to everybody in here and out there. I was astounded being invited to give a presentation in this colloquium. Honored, of course, but primarily astounded because I don't have any ongoing research to report on. And the only distinguishing feature I can claim is my age, which easily makes me the oldest, the most senior person in the room. But the invitation asked me to talk about the events leading to the establishment of HITS. That means about the past. And the past is the one property old people have a lot of. And so I think it was a match. When thinking about what to say, I found that a caveat up front would be quite useful. There's a common misunderstanding that age is correlated with wisdom. This probably dates back to pre-literate societies, but certainly has no relevance in current society. There is a correlation between age and not wisdom, but wisdom. But that's a completely different issue, and I don't want to talk about that. So what I can tell is some stories with no deeper meaning underneath or beyond, with no hidden agenda, and with no overarching take-home lessons, just stories. And you may find them irrelevant or boring or embarrassing or interesting. It's your call. So how was HITS started then? I think the best way to summarize this is by paraphrasing John the Evangelist, chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word came from Klaus, and the Word was HITS. And that's exactly how it started. But I guess in order for you to appreciate this, you will need a little more background. So let's do some background then. One has to appreciate that in the years around the turn of the millennium, 10 years before, 10 years later, there was a whole range of activities in the German academia to model or remodel their institutions by looking at British or American academic institutions or research institutions in order to be better, because all the British and American institutions came up top in international rankings, and Germany was somewhere in 50th, 70th, 90th, etc. rank, and they wanted to improve on this. And first move was adopt English as a teaching language, at least for some courses and later for some programs, and introduce the credit point system. There was this whole Bologna process, some of you may have heard about. If you haven't, don't go researching it, it's not worth it. But anyway, it was a fairly strong initiative during that time. It has abated completely from what I can tell, but in those days it was very important. Mandatory evaluations of teachers, not only students, I mean, that was established already, but of teachers was introduced, was something novel in those days. You probably can't imagine that, but again, I'm old, I can't remember. Institutions advertised their new orientation by adopting attractive names. Karlsruhe University, for example, turned into KIT. There is something quite famous on the other side of the Atlantic with IT at the end, just a different letter at the beginning. And they also adopted their appearance in the internet. All the German universities have, what they say, University of Heidelberg.de, and the others, Saarbrücken and Berlin and what. No, KIT has KIT.edu. So they even look American from that perspective. If you look at kit.de, you will be surprised. It has nothing to do with them. from what I can tell. Frankfurt established an institute called FIAS. You know, there is IAS at Princeton, the Institute for Advanced Studies, and this is the Frankfurt Institute of Advanced Studies. I'm not sure that this name is really very fortunate because, well, 2 letters in addition and you get something very interesting, but I don't want to go into this. And this movement was not limited to Germany. Other countries played the same game. Korea, for example, has a KAIST, Korea Advanced Institute for Science and Technology, complicated name. And the interesting thing there is it's not the science or the technology that is advanced, it's the institute that is advanced, whatever that means. But again, it was a movement to break out of the old models and do something different in order to be more successful, get more recognition, or generally be better, which is not a bad motivation at all. In most cases, it worked, but there were some cases where I should say it was just an example of cargo cult. Does anybody not know what cargo cult is? Should I briefly explain this? Okay, very briefly. Cargo cult originated in the islands of the South Pacific, where the people, you know, in the early years of the 20th century, later during World War II, observed a huge technology gap. You know, there were the indigenous people, you know, living in very primitive societies, and there were people coming in with airplanes and with machines and God knows, and having wonderful goods, wonderful things to eat and to drink and to wear and so on and so on. And at some point, these people, you know, the war ended, they moved away. And you know, people on these islands, they didn't want to give up these wonderful goods. And so they built from, you know, bamboo poles and whatever, look-alike airplanes and watchtowers and everything. And they went through the whole routine of what they had observed when the soldiers were in, you know, turning things that, and, you know, making beeping noises when the airplane came in. And they hoped that by doing so, mimicking the movements, they would still get the goods. And this whole thing is now studied by ethnographers as cargo cult, because cargo was the goal that they were after. And so in some cases, what happened in Germany was a little bit like cargo cult. Let's exchange all the headlines of our courses by English titles, and then we'll be better. Everything will work out. We have to admit, and Frauke already alluded to this briefly, that both Stuart and I, for a while, participated in this imitation game and this name-dropping game. I was involved in setting up a private university, which was all in English and modeled after blah, blah, blah. So that was an interesting experience. And Klaus did something very similar, as we will see in the next slide. He came into contact in the mid-90s with people from MIT, and especially with one of their latest, greatest startups, which was the Media Lab. Probably heard about that. And they were looking for expansion to other countries. They tried it in Japan and it failed. They tried it in Spain and it failed. And they finally contacted Klaus. And Klaus was interested in particular in their funding model, which was heavily relying on industry sponsoring. In those days, and I haven't looked up the latest numbers, but in those days, meaning back in the late 90s, if a company paid them $200,000 a year, they were given the right to see the research reports 2 months before they were published. Nothing else. If they wanted more, they would have to pay more. And Klaus was quite impressed by this, because collaboration between industry and research in Germany was generally not very strongly established, and he wanted to change that. And so the idea was to set up a collaboration with the Media Lab. And so they created the European Media Lab, EML, in '97. And the idea was to have a real branch of this lab in Germany and run on equal terms. It turned out that this collaboration, as Klaus envisaged it, was viewed as a franchise by the Americans, saying, here's our account number, send the money. And in return, you are allowed to put our famous name on your door. And that's it. Otherwise, no programmatic, no content-wise collaboration at all. And Klaus wasn't amused by this and canceled the contract after a few months, and that was that. On the other hand, the company already existed. So it was EML, European Media Lab. In those days, I remember it was a real struggle to get a German GmbH, something like a limited, with an English name into the books. We didn't have this yet, and we have to check whether this, and it took a couple of months, but so finally, after some struggle, we had this company, and we didn't want to give it up. The Americans wanted to have it, but they had no good reason for pushing this claim. So we kept the company and set it up as a research lab. And the first goal of this research lab to develop technological solutions that would support people in their daily work in whatever arena you can imagine in the most intuitive way possible. So using technology should not require you to become a technologist, but it should empower you to do things better than you would without. And so we had a whole range of interesting projects, something like you can use on a smartphone today, orientation, navigation, information, blah, 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 without smartphones existing in those days. And we built prototypes and published about this. The idea was never to really make products out of this. Klaus had established a successful company already, so he didn't have to do this again. He wanted to support research with a user-oriented perspective. One problem in this, and I don't want to go into any details because that's just boring and would take up too much time. This company was set up as a for-profit company for a whole range of interesting reasons, none of which has to do with research. But it had to be a for-profit company, and that limited its capabilities in participating in research projects in a very serious way. And so something needed to be changed about that. In 2003, we decided to split this company for that very reason into two parts. One, the old for-profit organization called EML, and one, a non-for-profit organization called EML Research. And EML Research would contain all the scientific activities which were more at the basic science end of the spectrum than the applied science end. And as a non-for-profit organization, they could apply for EU funding in an easier way. They could go to DFG for funding, et cetera, et cetera. So this thing was called EML Research, as I said. And well, we had a small building, which you can see still sitting next to Villa Bosch. When you approach Villa Bosch from the city and you go into Villa Bosch, there's a shabby old building which is not used anymore, uninhabited, leaking, blah, blah, blah. This was called Villa Supernova. And this was essentially the home of EML Research. It was very small, very limited. The projects run in EML Research were quite successful, and people were craving for more space, more, et cetera, et cetera. And this was a real difficulty. In 2008, or actually it started in 2007, the news came that this lot that we are on right now, neighboring the lot where Villa Bosch is located, would be up for sales. Originally, there was a sort of a research, technology, development, whatever you want to call it, lab run by the German Telecom. And they decided to sell the whole thing and move down to Heidelberg into much smaller facilities. And Klaus decided to by this thing. It's next to Villa Bosch, so we could easily expand the whole lot and use the buildings, etc. And that was a new perspective. Before this decision was really made, one day he came to my office and told me, look, I have an idea. We will start a new lab and we will call it HITS. And HITS stands for Heidelberg Institute for Theoretical Studies. Is that okay? Yeah, now we will have to work it out how this will be set up. And we will use the buildings on the Euroscom lot. Euroscom was the organization only the lot before. Let's work this out. And by the way, I have a wonderful way of explaining the name HITS. In those days, the Land Baden-Württemberg established the Pop Academy over in Mannheim. It still exists in educating future singers, songwriters, musicians, etc. And now Mannheim has the Pop Academy and we have HITS. Doesn't that sound funny? I said, yeah, it certainly does. So what's HITS going to do? Well, we'll figure that out. We first played with the idea of modeling HITS after IAS, the imitation game, the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton. We looked at it and tried to map our activities onto their organizational scheme. And it didn't really fit because they have subject areas which HITS clearly should not have. Klaus wanted to focus on natural sciences, mathematics, computer science, period, nothing beyond that. And IAS is set up completely differently. And it was also clear that by just mimicking their structure, there would be no reason why we should be as successful as IAS. The reason why IAS has such a great reputation is World War II. Many great Jewish scientists had to flee Europe and find a place where to go. Albert Einstein, Kurt Gödel, John von Neumann, just to mention a few. And they, over time, built the reputation for it. It already had a reputation, otherwise they wouldn't have gone there. But this overarching reputation is really due to this influence of brain from the outside. And of course, there's no way one can, or one even would want to repeat something like this. So we gave up this IAS model fairly early on. And there was also the question, we already have EML, we have ECML Research now, how should this be consolidated? One option would clearly have been to just discard those two and say, well, that was a false start, let's try again. But nobody seriously wanted to look into this. Now, HITS has an I in the name, the Heidelberg Institute. So far we have laboratories, EML. If you set up an institute, you have to be careful. And I'd quoted the rules that apply in the United Kingdom for institutes, and they're fairly serious. Unless you do really good, serious science, you're not allowed to call anything an institute. If you do so, it would be a criminal offense. And of course, I mean, we are in Germany, fortunately, so we can do whatever we want. But it's interesting that names would be regulated like this in some other countries. On the other hand, we have this similar rules in Germany. The name university, or no, Universität, I'm sorry. Universität is protected only for state-approved academic institutions as Universität. You can call yourself university, that's something different. It's English, it's not Universität. But for the German-speaking people in the audience, that's why Fachhochschulen, which see themselves as sort of underling competitors with the Universitäten, they are not allowed to call themselves Universitäten, but they call themselves University of Applied Sciences. And that's okay. So different countries, different rules, but we are on the safe side with the I in HITS, even by UK standards. So this was the basic question we had to decide fairly early on, how to orchestrate this transition. There were three options, basically. The first is, let's establish hits. We have the other two, we run them as usual, and hits is you kid on the block and gets its own budget, gets its own agenda, and so on. Problem is that at least ECML Research has had a very similar agenda, doing basic research in linguistics, in computational biology, et cetera, et cetera. And how would you decide which activity would go where? This one or that one? How would you orchestrate collaboration, blah, blah, blah. It would just be awkward in some sense. The other option is both ECMLs are shut down and the employees are moved over to the new organization, HITS. Yes, you can do this, but this would certainly have created this fair amount of motivation problems for the existing employees. Is our work not worth nothing? I mean, why would they shut us down? Why would so on? And we had this recently established ECML Research School, which is a contract with the University of Heidelberg, which basically regulated the process of appointing professors in a joint manner. The professors being primarily located at HITS, but being professors at the university having PhD rights and all that. And this was a contract we had finally worked out, signed, and everything shortly before this process started, and it was named ECML Research School. Now, doing this and having no ECML research, this was one aspect to consider. And the third option is merge HITS and ECML Research because of their topical adjacency into one organization and leave ECML, the original company, which is still a for-profit with a different agenda and so on the side, let it run on its own and just have two organizations under the name of HITS. And this was eventually the decision we made. It was not that ECML Research would be closed down or anything, but HITS would be established and both would be merged into one organization, finally with the name of HITS. This is, you can see it's a different slide layout and it's a little bit stretched. The old version had a different aspect ratio. It was 4:3 instead of 16:9, and so on. You see, it's old slides. I'm an old man, these are old slides. Easily tell. This is what, at some point, we told people at ECML Research about the plans. And none of this is actually made up or just for the purpose of communication. It just emphasizes the reasons why, in the first place, Klaus decided to acquire the adjacent lot at all. I mean, yes, Klaus liked to build and to have interesting projects, but it's one thing to buy something. The other thing is that you have to run something over time. You have to fund it, et cetera, et cetera. And he was genuinely interested in funding basic science. And that's why he wanted to do that. And it would not have been possible without this acquisition, with just ECML Research in its current resources alone.
Andreas?
Ja?
Entschuldigung. Die Zuhörer, die externen, bitten darum, ob sie am Mikrofon bleiben könnten, weil sie, wenn sie weiter reden, nicht so gut zu hören sind.
Okay. My sincere apologies to the people listening over the internet. I'm somebody who likes to walk around when talking, so being confined to one place is hard. Well, it will probably make me go faster. That's the good thing. So that's the next slide in this presentation we gave to people at ECML Research. And we told them about the new building and the new perspectives. There was an old villa, Villa Rainer, that's still there. There's an office building That's the current HITS building. And there also was, it wasn't mentioned here, but there also was a swimming pool between the HITS building and the old villa. That's where the benches are right now. And it was still in operation when Klaus bought it. And it was used in those days by one person for half an hour per week. And German Telecom picked up the bill and still paid this nonsense. But the first thing that was decided that this would be abolished. When we decided to buy this whole shebang, we made a tour through the building, through the current office building. And you know, we toured all the floors, and Klaus said, well, looks in pretty good shape. We probably have to change the carpets. We probably have to repaint the thing and put in better networks. But otherwise, you know, 3 months should be enough, and then we can start. This was in summer 2007. In 2009, the building was, end of 2009, was ready for people to move in. So the changes, modifications, and additions were a little more substantial than originally viewed. But as you know from other building projects, this is not unusual. Same, or not exactly in the same scope, it applies to the Villa Rainer, which also had to undergo a major revamping, for example, to put in networks, et cetera, et cetera. You have to appreciate that those buildings, especially Villa Rainer, are monument protected in Germany. And if something is monument protected, you basically are not allowed to do anything to it, but just maintain it. At least at the moment you buy it. What you do later on depends on who will learn about it. So it's a murky area. So then there was an explanation of what HITS would be. I skipped slides 1, 2, 3, and tried to illustrate what HITS, what the T could stand for, what we envisaged. And well, it's clear there would be no experimental equipment, you know, no big machines, no accelerators, no telescopes, no benches, no nothing, just computers. And what can you do with computers? Well, you can play with them, you can do all kinds of things. And one is do computational science or scientific computing. I mean, these are two different shades of the same sphere. But in principle, the suggestion was to focus HITS in its first phase, in its build-up phase, on those aspects. We also envisaged that in addition to the research groups, there would be other complementary activities with an interdisciplinary outlook. Interdisciplinarity was very important from Klaus' perspective, such as philosophers, science writers, et cetera, some of which has been implemented. Not everything. This is in German, because this was an internal memo slide for the preparation group. And it just illustrates what we had to do after the remodeling activities really started on this lot until we could start operating under the name of HITS early in 2010. And we needed an agenda on how to expand the scientific scope of the new institute, how to establish collaborations with other organizations, which I think, or I thought at the time, and Klaus agreed fully on this, was very important to make sure that this is not an island thing which nobody else in the world knows about. We needed a legal framework for running this thing. Sounds trivial, but it was actually most of the effort went into this. And then have sort of a time scale on how to build HITS until it filled the allotted rooms and its budget. We also needed a service group, an infrastructure for supporting scientists in what they did, and planning and implementing the technical infrastructure, mostly means servers, storage, networking, and network connecting from here to the German internet backbone down the university campus, and so on. In the early phases, we asked MPG, would they be interested in becoming a shareholder? Max Planck Gesellschaft, sorry, the non-German speakers. You know, this is the flagship scientific organization in Germany. Would they be interested in becoming a shareholder? And you know, discussions went back and forth, and finally in 2010, somebody from MPG management came, and after HITS already opened, so it was mid 2010, and you know, we presented what we did. We already had at least one new group active, and what the options would be, and so on and so on, and would they be interested? And you know, the guy was here for 4 hours, and then returned a 3.5-page letter outlining what MPG thought about this proposal. First of all, the letter made it very clear that they had completely ignored the fact that HITS already existed. From their perspective, the question was how to set it up in the first place. And here is the first slide explaining, I mean, I've largely abbreviated this. For them, it was very important that they set up something where the public spending rules that MPG is subject to, because they are financed by the federal government and state governments, and so they have all kinds of rules, you know, about paying and blah, blah, blah. And they didn't like that. They wanted to have something where money could be spent more freely. So this is the most important thing from their perspective. Let's later talk about the scientific content. Next thing is, of course, we have to make sure that the quality is not diluted by you not being MPG, because only MPG knows what quality is. And financing must be, of course, guaranteed. We must make sure about that. And we have to maintain a level where we can successfully attract first-star researchers and the best junior researchers in the world. Some examples given. So that was number one. Then they offered two options. I forget I've dropped the first one because it was not relevant at all. And the second one was a bit lengthy, so sorry for the small print. I should stay here, sorry. What it basically says, you don't have to read it in detail. What it basically says is, we need full control over this organization, period. In all decision-making bodies, we, MPG, need majority. No veto rights by anybody else. So we have control of the money. That's it. And the second paragraph basically says, well, this may not go down well with a sponsor, but you know, we run this thing based on mutual trust. And of course, because of this mutual trust to be maintained, we have to make sure that we have majority. Because you have to trust you, we don't trust you. Not the other way around. So it was pretty interesting. They wanted full control of the money. They wanted majorities in all matters, scientific, non-scientific, whatsoever. And this did not go down well with Klaus, as you can imagine. So this option was dropped at that moment. Sank like a stone. So what we did was following the KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid. We finally decided to start the whole thing by using the existing legal envelope we had called ECML Research and just rename it. Turned out that this was, from a tax perspective and all other conceivable perspectives, the easiest way to go. We used this company, everybody stayed in this company, no changes of contracts whatsoever. And it just was a new name. Of course, for the technicians, this was a little of more work because, you know, all the domain names had to change and all the links and all the blah, blah, blah. But this is a finite effort and could be handled with reasonable effort. Revamping of the building, as I said, was completed in January 2010. And then everybody was moved over from Villa Supernova, which was essentially abandoned at that point in time. And it was really was a close call because the roof was leaking and the pipes were leaking in some places. It's really an interesting thing. And so we scheduled the opening for spring 2010. We decided to add 2 new shareholders. You know, MPG was out of the game, but because of the existing contract, ECML Research School with University of Heidelberg, we were in close contact with them already. And so they were quite willing to become shareholders in this company. And the same thing, the same negotiations were started with KIT. And the basic reasons why we do this is to have the possibility of joint appointments of professors. Because unless you're a professor at the university, you are not allowed to supervise PhDs. Technically, you may supervise them, but not formally. You always need somebody at the university to sign off the whole thing. Remember, we started in spring 2010. The negotiations had started in 2009, and they were completed in 2014. So you can see what the real difficulty is, talking to lawyers. You know, each university has their legal department, and they all want to say something about this and this and that. And it takes a while. You know, one interesting question is how much do they have to pay? Because yes, the university wanted to become a shareholder, but they didn't want to pay anything. And HITS has a lot of worth, at least in the books. And so in case something goes wrong, you know, how much would we have to pay up for this and this and that, and so on. So this was, and we find constructions which basically didn't make them pay anything, but still had a sizable majority in the shareholders' assembly and so on. It worked out. Took a while, but it worked out. We set up the HITS Foundation as the majority shareholder in this shareholders' assembly. And HITS Foundation still exists. It had a slightly different purpose in life originally. This has changed, but I don't want to go into that. But the good news is that establishing new research groups was much faster than this legal process. But by using the old legal envelope for HITS, we didn't have to wait for that to complete. We could just move ahead with a renamed ECML Research and then do all the changes to the contracts while we were already running. So that was essentially the optimal solution. So the first research group was already established in, I think, either late 2009 or early 2010, and the others came not very long after that. This is from Klaus Schier's opening address. It's in German. I didn't translate it. The first line is his something that he repeated very often. You know, the difference between us and Mannheim. Why we didn't follow the IAS model, and why we focus on computing, use of computing, not computer science, but use of computing. And we set up a fairly sizable, by those days standards, server farm over in the Villa Rainer. And we already had a very fast internet connection down to the university to get access to the international internet. And that was one of the key requirements. Otherwise, the whole claim doing computational science would have been unfounded. The inaugural lecture was given in March 8 by an old friend of mine, Janet Wing. She was the director for the computer science program in the National Science Foundation for many years. and then moved on to become a vice president at Microsoft. And she talked about her notion of computational thinking. And the basic message is that computational thinking is sort of a methodical basis for doing complicated things, for dealing with complexity, for dealing with scale. If you have many, many things, large amounts of data, how do you handle these? Well, computation probably has an answer. If you have very complex things that you want to model, how can you deal with this? Well, abstraction and all the formalisms going with this may be of help. The new structure established in 2014, roughly 4 years after we actually started, is this one. And as far as I know, it's going to be modified again later this month. There will be more bubbles in this picture. That's second law of thermodynamics, complexity always grows. But the basic thing is the gray area up there, that's a normal German GmbH, a limited. You have a shareholders assembly and you have at least one managing director. And the blue area is something that we added, group leaders assembly, scientific advisory board, and what so far was called speaker, but even on this old slide, it's called scientific director, and I think that's what it's now returned to. So there's some kind of cyclic development and some other details. But that's basically the blue thing that was added to what ECML Research had before. The initial members of the SAB are these persons. Some of them are still around, but most of them are not. And except for Stefan Hell, who was a contact of the Klaus Tschira Foundation, all the others are old friends, buddies, colleagues of mine, because we had to get somebody to give us some feedback. And they all had, I think it's fair to say, very solid background in their respective areas and could give us good feedback. At the end of 2015, that's basically when I left. That's the end of the scope that I can cover. This was HITS. There were about 110 staff, 13 research groups, some junior, some regular, and 2 other groups, the administrative services and the IT services. By that time, the buildings were reasonably filled, from what I can remember. What is the common theme? That's just a repetition of what I already said. It's computational science. And it has served as sort of a loose guideline during the process of acquiring new research groups. We never intended to find somebody in, let's say, macroeconomics or in history of arts or something like that, but something that can be subsumed under these methodical principles. And I don't know how far this carries in the future. I mean, science evolves, methods evolve, goals evolve. So all this is not cast in concrete. And maybe at some point, even the name of HITS would have to be changed. I mean, this would be a complete disaster, I know. But who knows how long this acronym still is useful. This was October 10, 2015. The building, of course, was already in use for 5 years. But that was the day when the name was unveiled. The guy with a bald head, that's me. And this is Gerda Tschira, wife of the then late Klaus Tschira. Klaus certainly never would have agreed to have this on this building. He was not that kind of person. But people who succeeded in his responsibilities said this would be a good move to identify the importance of his person for all the activities in that building. And I think it's very good once in a while to remember this. Without his passion for science, none of this would ever have happened. And fortunately, he was not somebody to support soccer clubs or something like that. He really believed in science. And it's very fortunate that we had him. Unfortunately, he passed away way too soon in early 2015. But I think everybody succeeding him in whatever responsibility is trying to continue things along the lines of what he would have found useful and reasonable, except for this naming, but that's okay. That's it. Thank you.